evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to give some short introductions, and then I'll turn it over. Professor Catherine Cornille is the first female chairperson of the theology department. Prior to joining the faculty at Boston College, Professor Cornille taught for 10 years in the Department of Theology at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium. In addition to lecturing and teaching around the world, Professor Cornille leads Boston College's annual symposia on interreligious dialogue. Professor Jeff Bloechl joined the faculty of the philosophy department in 2001 after teaching at the College of the Holy Cross. He is currently the director of graduate studies in the philosophy department and also travels the world lecturing in his area of study, the philosophy of religion and metaphilosophy. He is also president of Philosophers in Jesuit Education. Jeff and Catherine are married and have the gift of 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. We welcome them tonight to their first Agape Latte.
The Camino to Santiago de Compostela is one of several pilgrimages Christians can make, and of course we could widen the horizon quite a bit and say that many of the world religions include pilgrimage in their faith experience. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela has many routes, the most famous of which is the Camino Frances, that passes from the French border at Roncesvalles, which is south of Lourdes, across Basque country and Galicia, eventually to, if you go far enough beyond Santiago, to Finisterre, the end of the world, to the Atlantic Ocean. The other routes include a path that comes from nearly the bottom of Spain right up the middle of the country, again to the cathedral in Santiago, and a number of others. The most famous, the Camino Frances, is about 800 kilometers long. We went with a friend, we'll talk about that in a minute. We joined him well into the Camino. He did the entire thing, and it took him about a month, a little less than a month. We walked for about a week of that time, ending in Santiago with our children. So there were 6 of us. The history of the Camino is contested, and I see no particular reason to try to sort out which story is right, but most of them say something like this. The area of Santiago is pre-Christian, which is to say, in this case, specifically Roman and perhaps something even before that. The story relating specifically to Christianity picks up when it is said, according to one or another legend, that Saint James, Santiago, the evangelist, is the brother of Jesus, is buried in the site now covered by the cathedral. One of the versions says that his body, by way of a couple of stops, burials and exhumations and reburials, ended up in that area between the 3rd and the 4th century. In any case, there is a record of a holy place and a pilgrimage to that holy place, beginning at least in the 8th century, if not a bit earlier than that. By the 12th or 13th century, there is a clear record of many pilgrims coming from all over Europe to that particular place. We met, in our experience, people who had been walking from as far as Poland and even farther than that. So, of course, you meet remarkable people with remarkable stories along the way. I think that I'll let Catherine talk about the infrastructure of the Camino a bit and our experience of it, but I'll just add for now that it is very well constructed, mainly through the efforts of a German priest who took an interest in a revival of the Camino beginning in the 1960s. It's impossible or virtually impossible to get lost. You're rarely very far from a place to stay. There is food to be bought at regular intervals all along the way, fresh water, and so on. Of course, it wasn't always that way through the Middle Ages, but in fact, you're not exactly roughing it in the sense of risking your life when you're on the Camino these days. It's a lot of walking. The climate and the terrain are challenging, but beyond that, it's not terribly difficult, it seems to me.
So the idea for going on the Camino came to us about a year ago. Jeff, my husband, and his friend, who's the superior of the Jesuits in Russia, started to talk about this, and then we came to the idea that this would be a wonderful time for us to do this as a family Our oldest daughter was a senior in high school and was just about to go to college. Our second child is a son, and he's now a senior. So we're really in a time of transition as a family. Our kids going off to college, and we thought this would be really the time to do something like that together, to have this kind of experience together. So the kids were all three on board right away until a few days before the Camino started, when our youngest daughter, who's 14 years old, said, "Wait a minute, we're going to walk every day from morning till evening and do nothing else but walking." So she suddenly started to back out of the trip, and we started to get nervous. Oh, what did we get ourselves into, and how are we going to manage, and so forth. But we had tried to sort of prepare ourselves for the Camino by going on a 10-mile hike the month before we went, and we thought, okay, we can do this. We had no idea how much we were going to walk when we started the Camino and how it was going to be, but we just sort of went and bought ourselves good shoes and good backpacks and left for the Camino. It actually took us quite a while. It took us a full day of travel by bus and so forth to get to the point where we were going to meet our friend, which was about 100 miles away from Santiago. So in many ways, we feel like we've cheated a little bit when we saw all these people coming from 800 kilometers, having traveled sometimes 1,000 or more miles, and 2 or 3 months had been on the way. So doing about 100 miles, sometimes felt a little bit like cheating, but we felt like with our children, we really couldn't afford to do much more than that, or put them through much more than that. We also felt like we had to end up at Santiago. We couldn't really, many people do the Camino where they take stretches of the Camino, and they do a particular stretch year after year. I don't know if you know Professor Cornille in the philosophy department, but he and his wife have also been doing this for many years. But we felt like we really had to end up in Santiago. So we started in Ocebrero, just a gorgeous little town up in the mountains. And I will never forget the day we started the Camino. Our spirits were high, we had no pain, it was beautiful, the nature everywhere around us was just gorgeous, and I was just so filled with joy and gratitude that we were able to do something like this with our family. So we started in high spirits, and it was just an amazing beginning. Then, the first day we also thought we could keep walking and walking, because we were indeed quite fit. And the first part of the Camino went down, as you know, from Ocebrero, it's all going down, and you think you're fine going down and down, until suddenly you realize that going down is in many ways much harder than going uphill on your legs and your feet and so forth. So by the end of the day, our youngest daughter was crying. We arrived, finally, we were going all the way to a monastery, and we all arrived there in different batches. Actually, we had already sort of broken up by 2s and 3s by the time we arrived there. But that was really a hard stretch for at least our youngest daughter. And then, we took it day by day. We just had a vague plan of where we were going to end up. We carried all of our luggage with us in our backpack. We never sort of booked a hotel or a hostel on beforehand. We just took our backpacks and walked until we were ready to eat. And there, as Jeff said, albergues and restaurants all along the way where we could eat. And the path is also very well marked with yellow arrows. So it was really never a problem where to go or where to eat. Where to sleep, that was sometimes a problem, because sometimes at the end of the day we would think that we would sleep somewhere and there wouldn't be room in the albergue. And then I remember one day we had to actually walk another 10 kilometers to the next albergue when we thought we were going to stop, and that was particularly hard on some of us. So all in all, the experience actually was really amazing for us as a family. there were different sides to the experience, things that we would like to talk about, what it did to us as a family, but also what it did to each of us individually. Because, of course, a pilgrimage is something that you do on your own, pretty much in relationship to God and with a particular very individual or very personal goal or purpose. And that would have been different for each one of us going on the Camino. And, you know, to start us off, I can say that one thing that was clear to me is that the intention you go with is often not the intention that develops along the way, or the experience you have at the end of the Camino. Being a theologian, you know, I had all kinds of theories about pilgrimage and why we do it and why people have done it throughout the ages and what was going to happen. So a particular challenge for me starting the Camino was really to try to shed all of those expectations and all of those preconceived ideas of what a pilgrimage is and what it's supposed to do to us, and really allow myself to be open to anything that would happen along the way, and to be open to the grace of God in whatever way it manifested itself. And to me, that sort of was a constant theme along the way of the Camino, this experience of complete abandonment to divine providence. We never knew where we were going to sleep or where we were going to eat, who we were going to meet. All of that were experiences that came along the way, and in itself, I think, just that complete abandonment and going from day to day and from moment to moment with what God had in stock for us was itself a really profound experience for me.
Yeah, just to pick up on that last thing, I don't want to overly intellectualize, but I'll maybe share a couple of thoughts and then talk a bit more about some heartfelt experiences. Two related thoughts, I guess. My most recent real commitment to some kind of strong spiritual, let's say, experiment or discipline was in some Orthodox monasteries in Greece. And I thought going into this pilgrimage experience that it would be quite different, and of course in many ways it really was. But I started to think about a couple of things that do have a connection back to the very different experience of trying to contemplate and to pray in silence and so on. One was this. Actually, there is this much in common. When you settle yourself before God while you're nonetheless in the world, and you make just a little bit of progress with that, the things of the world and the space of the world become a little bit different. So things become provisions that you carry with you or that are useful for you only to sort of go on being in the presence of God. Now, that I find is already the case in monastic life, for example, at least as far as I understand it. It is vividly the case in the pilgrimage experience, right? You just can't carry more than a certain amount, and so you've got to trust that by the time that is out, there will be more of it. And food becomes something you become a bit deliberate about. You don't eat heavy, greasy food for obvious reasons, and so on. So that I found interesting to realize. On the other hand, in my own experience, walking along, and it is indeed, it is sometimes breathtakingly beautiful. We walked, I remember in particular, a long walk through an oak forest where there were cow pastures on both sides of the path, and now and then a cow passing by through the path in front of us, very quiet, extremely beautiful. So you walk along, and I thought, I realized this, for me, moving is somehow more intimately related to thinking than it is to praying. I sure wouldn't impose that on anyone else. It was just my experience. My thoughts came to me one after another, very, very clearly, and achieving some depth without me having to work on it while I was walking along. But every now and then I had the rather frustrating realization, at least for me, that you know, I came here to have some kind of prayer experience, and precisely that seems to be eluding me. And I think for me, I realized that my prayer life is probably, the rhythm that belongs to me or my soul is probably more clearly connected with being still. I find it much easier in that organization of myself. Should I go on?
I can. So I said before that different people have different motivations or intentions for going on the pilgrimage, and that's one of the things that I found also very moving, is you meet people on the Camino, and everyone is there with a certain vulnerability and openness to one another, and it's incredibly easy to fall into very deep conversations with people along the Camino about their lives and about their questions and about their hopes and about their frustrations and so forth. So it's really a context and an opportunity for really very profound conversation and very deep sharing. On the other hand, I also felt always very disoriented when we had gone through experiences like that of very deep and personal sharing with people, and then our paths went in different directions again, and we never saw them again. So these moments of just very profound sharing that you normally only have with your deepest friends, you have very easily with people you don't know, and then people take off again. And there's something in some ways also, I suppose, very beautiful and symbolic about that as part of life also, but it was also somewhat unsettling because many people come on the Camino with really very deep troubling experiences and seeking meaning in their life, and so it's very you have these very intense experiences with people, and you want to accompany them somehow beyond that moment that you share with each other, and then you can't, they're gone, which is, I suppose, also part of life.
I want to remember, I know we both want to remember to say that if you're interested in a film that gives I think we agree, a pretty good, accurate sense of the Camino experience, there's a film called The Way that came out no more than 2 years ago. With Martin Sheen. It's really very well done and very moving, and a lot of the scenes in it we certainly recognized. So to remember that. I didn't have any expectations and maybe not even any particular desire for sort of powerful experience of any particular kind, but there were a couple, and maybe it's related to getting tired towards the end. I don't think so, but it could be that. Your defenses go down a bit and you open up. But I'll just talk about a couple of them to give you an idea of things that do happen to people. I think we agree one of the most beautiful moments for us, for Catherine and me, was coming over the last hill as you finally see the valley where Santiago is. You don't actually see the cathedral until you kind of come around a corner and walk a bit more, but the end is near. And it's a big drop. And for whatever reason, however it worked out, ahead of us were our 3 kids walking side by side. Remember, we have a beautiful picture of that. They rarely walk side by side, but there they were. And not too long after that, Tony, this friend of ours that was with us, said, it was just Catherine and Tony and me together. He said, why don't we pray? And we hadn't really, we had Mass together every day. Tony's a Jesuit priest. And for a while we were paced with a Spanish group that included a priest. And so the group of us came together, maybe Catherine will talk about that, for Mass several times along the way. But we hadn't really, done sort of group sharing or prayer out loud of that sort. And for whatever reason, he said, why don't we say a prayer together? And we said the Our Father or something together. And then it was quiet. And I started to think of why Tony was there. And part of it had to do with the fact that his brother, who had died after an illness in the early 1990s, had wanted to go to the Camino. And he and Tony had an agreement they were going to do it together, and then Joe died. And so Tony was doing it partly for Joe. And his intention, we found out, when he got to the cathedral was indeed to register Joe's name as if Joe had done it. It's something you do when you get to the cathedral. We can show you the paperwork for that in a minute. So I said, well, why don't we pray for Joe? And we prayed, and then I said, why don't we pray for my mother, who had died when I was very young? And then we prayed for Catherine's brother, who had died about 10 years ago now. And this, for me, was a very strong experience of just, what are people looking for? And what is it that comes to you, sometimes unexpectedly, that brings you together in God? A little bit later in that same day, I decided, I had started to think about it, I think out of the blue the night before. I decided I'm going to go to confession when I get to the cathedral. I don't do that very often, I have to admit, and I'm not sure why. I just felt drawn to sort of follow through and do that. It's a large cathedral, and there are probably 10 priests hearing confessions pretty much all the time, and you just have to walk around and find a confessional with a notice overhead saying that the priest speaks one of the languages you speak, so I found one. It had turned out to be a German priest. And for me, that was a very, very strong experience. It felt very much like that was waiting for me to get there, even though I hadn't known it until I arrived.
I'd like to say a few things about doing this Camino with one's children. For me, that was a very special experience. In today's world, teenagers are so wrapped up in all their activities and all the things that pull them away and all the distraction and entertainment that pull us away from each other. We have had the habit throughout our life of camping for a few days after the academic year finishes, after the school year finishes. We just take our tents and we go and camp for 3 or 4 days just to be together for a little while with no distraction, and to go hiking and swimming and just to be together and cooking together on the fire and so forth. So we had some taste of that, but on the Camino, we were together every day from morning till evening, walking together every day. And that was a really special experience also because, when you're living at home together, you usually talk to each other in a very functional way when things have to be done, or, about their schoolwork and their activities and so on. So the relationship gets quite functional, and there's often not much time to talk about feelings or thoughts or experiences that we have. And just to have all this time together, you're just walking, nothing particular has to be done or has to come to you, and then you just sort of wait for the inspiration. And sometimes there were really moments of very deep sharing that I'll always remember with each of our children separately, because you don't usually walk 5 people in a pack, it's usually 2 by 2. And, I had sort of a very special time with each of them individually where, just thoughts and experiences and things came up that were really quite amazing, and that I'll always remember sort of as a really special time and sharing that we had together. I want to share something of our youngest daughter, the one that we were so worried about. She ended up really being amazing on the Camino. We often sort of sent her way ahead of us, or she just took off and went way ahead of us, and we told her where we were going to meet, and she sometimes walked with our other children. But she kept a journal every day, and I just want to read to you, with her permission, something from her journal. It's an episode that really was very important for her. So this she wrote after a day that was really particularly difficult for me, just physically. But at the end of the day, we went, or we tried to say Mass in a church, but the church was closed, and so our friend Tony, together with a Spanish priest, said Mass outside of the church, and they usually, just pull together Catholics who happen to stop at that place to say Mass together. And Julia writes, "It was a great Mass. I think it was one of the most meaningful Masses I've ever had. We all gathered, and half of the Mass was in English and half in Spanish. Instead of a real homily, we did something different, where we said what on the Camino had meaning to us. One girl told us about how when she began the Camino, she had hemorrhaging, and the doctors all wanted to give her forms of treatment, but she wanted to give God a chance to help her. This led her to the Camino. Finally there, one day she submerged herself in a pool of water, and ever since she had no trouble. Another woman told us how she came on the Camino to suffer joyfully for the salvation of those who died before us. And she was grateful to God she could suffer joyfully. Lastly, a man said the Camino reminded him of life. Sometimes it's difficult and makes you suffer, but you have those moments of true and wonderful beauty. This experience was sort of my Camino epiphany. I began to see how God works in such amazing and mysterious ways. I began to see how God puts us through suffering and painful things so that we can have moments like those of Mass that day, where we come together to realize that God is part of us and we are all brothers and sisters. I'm beginning to see that people just need to trust in God's plan, and we will all have great moments in life, or have painful moments that make us better people." So, so these kinds of experiences for her, and she said, this was really a very important moment in her life of faith and in her developing experiences. Our two older children didn't keep journals themselves, but when at the end of the Camino we asked if they would do it again, both of them said, without hesitation, that they certainly would. Probably not with us, but they certainly would do it again.
You can see we could talk about it for a very long time. I'm not sure what else I have to add, but one thing that came to mind listening to Catherine is it was also, I think, a chance for all of us to see very clearly people just taking care of each other. That was very moving to me sometimes. So you got to know, for example, that when you stay in the albergues or in the monastery, you're up and out at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they shake you and kick you out. So you've got to get up and get going, and it's really for your own good, because it gets hot by noon, and so you better get some miles behind you. And that means people tend to stagger in at 4, 5, 6 o'clock, and sometimes later if they're really ambitious or something happened along the way. And what you see in the evening and what you see again in the morning, a lot of the time is people physically taking care of each other. So, strangers taking, you can't sometimes see your own feet well enough to tend to the blisters and so on. So there are people that just do that for each other. And we heard a story of a guy who's just out there moving back and forth on the Camino, tending to other people's feet. That's just an extraordinary side of the human condition that we don't take time to do for one another or see in one another very often. There are a number of things like that, I think.
Mm-hmm. I just thought I'd start the question portion. But I was just wondering, you've had so many powerful experiences while you were on the Camino. How did that transfer back into your life once you came back into your daily life and into your daily routine? How were you able to transfer those experiences from your pilgrimage into that?
I don't know if there's sort of one clear answer to that. We often talk about the Camino among each other. My youngest daughter keeps saying, "Oh, I miss the Camino, I miss the Camino." I think there was something about how the bonding that took place during that time, and the fact that we were constantly together, and the depth of the presence of one another to each other. I think that can't always be there in daily life. But I think having experienced it, we also know what can be, and sort of we still have, I suppose there's still that longing to sort of connect to one another in that particular way. But I think for each of us, it's it manifests itself in a different way. I was going through, for myself, through a particular process of discernment that I came to some kind of conclusion through the Camino, and that discernment was about my daily life. So in that sense, what the Camino does is sort of prepare you again for life. It's very interesting. My oldest daughter, for example, she for 3 days before the Camino, she was really counting the days for it to end. Before it ended, she was really counting the days, only 3 more days, and then when that third day came there, she sort of felt a little bit forlorn, like, so now what do we do? And I think there's a kind of discipline of sort of letting go of the Camino also. I think that's probably much more the case for people who have been on it for a long time, like our friend Tony, who had done it for a whole month. Last days was really talking about letting go of the Camino and letting the Camino be the Camino. So, you go through a personal journey and a transformation while you're on it, and you carry the fruits of it back into your daily life, and hopefully, it'll be something that will help you in your decisions and in your way of relating to other people and so forth. But, I think letting the Camino be the Camino is also an important part of the journey.
Yeah, I think that's about right. The Camino is the Camino. The way is the way. Life is a way. I missed the simplicity of living that way for a while afterwards, and of course you've got to realize that as strangely complicated and bustling life is in the setting like this, still simplicity it's a mindset, it's a way of being. It's not necessarily a pace or the things you surround yourself with. It's how you relate to all of that. I can see that. I'm not saying that I'm good at it. So letting the Camino be the Camino, let life be what it is.
Okay, if anyone has a question, I'll hand you the microphone. What would you say the average amount of time people go on the Camino is?
I think that's hard to say. I think that 1 week is a frequent number. I don't know why. Maybe that just seems like a good round number, or that's what people can schedule most easily. It's doable. We all had our little physical problems, but none of them were dramatic. I never felt anything like in doubt that we would finish. Going 2 weeks or 3 or a month, that becomes a major undertaking. And you hear stories of people who have had, their blisters became infected, they had to stop. Or the terrain became too difficult and they had to stop. You hear funny stories too. Someone Tony walked with for a while had obviously packed too much, and he was tearing pages out of books and things like that to try and lessen his pack. None of that really comes up in a week, and we ran into a lot of people that had chosen more or less that amount of time. And there is, by the way, we felt sort of, it's true, embarrassed about having only done a week compared to the people who did a month, but there's no judgment at all. Mm-hmm. Among the pilgrims, and that goes spiritually as well, huh? We met very pious Catholics who had come from Lourdes straight down to the Camino and carried on. We also met people who professed to really believe nothing in particular. There is this sense of, everyone is out there searching. You take the time you give yourself to it for whatever reasons are important to you, and that's what we have in common.
Could you talk a bit more about how you planned the trip and what you took into account, or what maybe you didn't take into account that came up?
So as I said, we really didn't plan very much in terms of exercising. We're all pretty fit. Our children certainly are. But I think we were also thinking that we would be capable of at least making it in the time we had allotted ourselves. Yeah, so we didn't prepare that way, but we did prepare certainly by buying good shoes. So we had good walking shoes, and other than that, we just had the backpacks, and we knew that we needed to bring as little as possible, and so we were all prepared for that. So other than that, we didn't prepare very much. We also, as I said, we didn't know how much we could handle. So after we had walked 10 miles in preparation, we thought, okay, maybe we can do 15 miles. But then once you start walking, the first day we walked 22 miles. We were tired at the end of the day, but the next day we got up, and it's amazing how your body replenishes overnight. That was, to me, sort of one of those miracles. At the end of the day, we were tired and cold and shivering, and sometimes you think, oh, am I going to be able to do it? And the next day, you're back in full force and going again at 7 o'clock. So some days we did 20, 22 miles. Other days we did, 18 miles, or one day we did 27 miles. So you really, once you get going, you can't imagine how much you're capable of actually until you do it. And if you have the whole day in front of you also, you start in the morning, you walk until lunch, you take a little break, and then you put your backpacks back on. What I noticed was that a lot of people walked only in the morning and then stopped at noon and did other things in the afternoon, whereas we always walked also in the afternoon, and then we were practically alone. We never, came across other people on the Camino at that time. So that was a nice sort of quiet time. Sometimes in the morning it was quite busy. And that was something we actually hadn't sort of prepared for. We thought the Camino would be sort of quiet and, give a lot of chance for solitude, but there are actually a lot of people on the Camino. And so, a lot of young people also, and, sort of a festive atmosphere sometimes. People, as I said, people do it for all kinds of reasons, and young people, find each other, and then, so, but in the afternoon it was much more quiet and contemplative. But that's about all we did. We didn't really do a whole lot else.
There are good guidebooks, and although it is marked very well, I think we took one wrong turn once, and that cost us maybe a half mile each way. A map is a pretty good idea, just so there are good maps that tell you where the next albergues and the next cafes are. So well, in an hour we'll be able to eat, which is very important with kids along. But it may sound like a dramatic sort of thing to do. Actually, it's very easy. In terms of the preparation and the practicalities, you get there and you just start walking, and it's pretty evident what to do. You kind of go from marker to marker. Where there's a branch in the road, there's always a blue tile with a yellow arrow telling you which way to go, and often enough you see people heading in that direction anyway. I really think if you think you're able to make the flight over to Spain, and you can get your way to where the Camino crosses, it's an evident thing to try to do. It's not nearly as difficult or peculiar as it may sound. Catherine is holding up here, what are those called again?
Credenciales.
A credencial, that's right. So as you walk along, wherever you stop for a meal or for the night, you get a stamp. And we're back to the practicalities now. When you get to the cathedral in Santiago, you have to show your credencial. And if it gives evidence of having walked more than 160 kilometers or more than 7 days, you get a Compostela. This is shown in the movie, by the way. They ask you a bunch of questions. It's a deliberately fairly spiritual experience. Why did you do it? Were there any particular experiences that struck you along the way? This is in a small room with people who do this for a job. And then they give you this form, all in Latin, and they add your name to it and the date. And so this is that Nicholas's? Mm-hmm. You save them, of course. It's really a dear thing to us. The only other thing we brought along is what is this called? The scallop shell. In French, that's the coquille Saint-Jacques. They're in this shell. I guess I left that part out of the story. The origin of this is that, at least one version of the story is that the ship bearing the body of St. James sank and his body washed ashore covered in these shells. They're all over the Atlantic in that part of Europe. And pilgrims started carrying them for very practical reasons. I mean, you can dig with this, you can eat your food in this, you can hold water in it. And you buy them, and you see little holes. You string them, people string them to their backpack, and as you walk along in the morning, sometimes in the dark, you can hear them clinking around you in the quiet.
I know that you said that your children were eager to do it again and that many people do it multiple times. Would you want to go on it again, or is it a once-in-a-lifetime experience that you wouldn't want to take away from?
We don't have any particular plans yet to do it. I would be happy to do it again. I don't know, in the list of priorities in life and the things that can be done, if I would immediately do it again. But yes, I would do it again. Probably also, in a different format. I think when you do it with a family, for us, I think there was a lot of consciousness of our children and how they were doing, and our relationship with them was very important on this pilgrimage. If we would do it again, I would probably want to do it in a time that was maybe a little bit more quiet, and then just do it with Jeff.
Just had to be sure. I would actively like to do it again. When we got back, I did some looking into. By the way, there are tremendous websites you can explore. I think I would like to try the path that comes up the center of Spain. I mean, for other reasons, it goes near Segovia and places like that. That would interest me for other reasons, but also just different terrain, a different kind of experience, and maybe you saw Catherine hinting at it. I was the one that had a little problem with the noise as we started to get surrounded by school groups and things like that. The idea of a bit more open country, longer stretches where you see very few people would appeal to me, and I would like to do that with you.